Welcome everybody to our 6th CJS lecture for winter 2023. I'm Emma Cook. I think many of you know me, but I'm a social and medical anthropologist and this year's Toyota visiting professor at CJS. Before we begin today, I'd just like to make some general announcements. First, please join us next week on Thursday, February 23rd, 2023, for the next lecture in the winter 2023 CJS lecture series titled Border Crossings, Transnational and Exophonic Voices in Contemporary Japanese Literature, which will be given by Professor Gregory Hesnajat, who is the Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Literature in the Faculty of Global and Interdisciplinary Studies at Hosei University. Also, 3 weeks from today, on March 9th, there will be the 8th entry in the Diamonds by the Decade, the Best of CJS's 75th Anniversary Film Series. There will be a screening of the 2000s film Toni Takitani, directed by Jun Ichikawa, and it will be shown at the State Theatre in Theatre 1 at 7:15 p.m. As usual, more information and tickets are available from the Michigan Theatre website. For those attendees joining the webinar today, webcams and microphones have been muted, as we always do, but we do, of course, invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions you have. The presenter will, of course, try to address as many of these as possible in the Q&A section at the end of the talk. The live transcription or closed caption will be enabled, but if you would rather not have it, please just go to the bottom right corner of your screen to disable it. As ever, please check out the CJS events page or the U of M or various social media for CJS lectures, which is scheduled in the remainder of winter 2023. Now I'd like to get to the meat of today, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel White to you all. He is currently an affiliated researcher with the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And in 2022, he published a really fascinating book titled Administering Affect, Pop Culture Japan and the Politics of Anxiety, in which he explores pop culture Japan and how state administrators have targeted political anxiety as a national problem, with the branding of pop culture being touted as the remedy. It's a really great book. I can't recommend it enough. And I really hope you all check it out. In his current research, Dr. White explores cross-culturally how human emotion and well-being is implicated in affective computing and the building of AI in Japan, Europe, and North America. For a much more comprehensive introduction to his work than I can give you in this short period of time, I really encourage you to check out his website, www.modelemotion.org. And with that, I'd really like to turn the floor or the screen over to Dr. White for his talk today titled Technically Well, Machine Models for Emotional Health Beyond the Human.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma, for that very generous introduction. And please let me also thank everybody at the Center for Japanese Studies for the invitation. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you all today. So I'd like to jump right in and start with a bit of context setting to explain what I mean by this phrase, technically well, and why I'm proposing to discuss models for emotional health that extend our imagination beyond the human with this phrase that I've used here. This question of what it means to be technically well emerged for me as I observed an interesting set of kind of contradictions around how people are evaluating health and well-being in Japanese society over the past few decades. And in particular, I'm interested in the period over the last decade where the Japanese national government, as well as research organizations in Japan, have been investing quite heavily in what is called human-centered artificial intelligence, or HCAI, as a strategy to balance the benefits of economic development that come with technological development with the technological costs to well-being, or some of the potential technological costs to well-being, or shiawase, as it's often called in Japanese government literature. So especially in government reports, such as there's a big government report on science and technology, which is released every 5 years by the Japanese cabinet. And in its latest one, the 6th Science and Technology Basic Plan, Many of the technologies that the government was describing here were again called quote unquote human-centered or ningen chushin, precisely because they focus specifically on emotion recognition in order to improve attentiveness and care for their human users. Or I should say that a number of these technologies, because they do emphasize emotional connection and some even emotional recognition, they are begging a very interesting question for me about how we understand what emotion is when we see emotion through the eyes of technologies like companion robots, for example, which is primarily what I'm going to be talking about today. So, for example, there are recently companion robots emerging in Japan today for the mass market from places like SoftBank with the robot Pepper in the middle of your screen there, Sony with the robot-like dog Aibo on the left of your screen. And many of these robots can indeed recognize facial expressions. They can recognize emotion from voice inflections, although to a very limited degree. And even there's other technologies in Japan, like not only in Japan, but particularly in Japan, cameras, for example, by Panasonic, which are designed to detect anxiety through heart rate variations, which are actually visible in light variations of blood vessels in the skin. So lots of new exciting technologies which presume to read human emotion. And this is what I'm really interested in focusing on in my research. Now, these technological advances raise a question of concern, I think, both to technology users as well as to social scientists like myself. And it's essentially this: if emerging emotion-focused AI technologies are quote unquote human-centered, then what kinds of human emotion do they envision through their technological platforms of mediation? Or put in other words, if the forms of emotion these technologies measure are largely measurable and mediated by digital technologies that rely on quantitative metrics for well-being, such as heart rate variability, or even the quantitative analytics that go into reading a facial recognition, facial expression recognition, which I'll explain later, then I wonder if it might be a good idea to evaluate how people in Japan are assessing if they are indeed genuinely well when they are in the measurements of these technologies technically well. So in short, I'm asking, are people most well in Japan when they are technically well, and how are people evaluating and assessing this question? So to answer this, I want to look today at three particular examples from research that I've been doing the last 5 years with my close colleague, Hirofumi Katsuno. And I want to focus namely on social robots that are built to connect emotionally with humans. And rather than suggesting that these technologies are emotionally good or bad for people, in particular in Japan, I want to just show a few ethnographic examples of how different people in Japan are imagining the potential for emotionally positive relationships between humans and robots. And then by doing so, hopefully generate some interesting reactions and questions from you all. And I very much look forward to that discussion. Now, before launching into the discussion, it might be fair to ask, why are people in Japan imagining the possibility of positive relationships with robots at all? This is obviously an enormous question with a very long history that is actually addressed quite superbly by scholars other than myself. People like Cosima Wagner, Hirofumi Katsuno, my close colleague, and then most of all by Michigan's very own resident Japan robot specialist, Jennifer Robertson. So instead of trying to summarize their wonderful work here, I'd rather simply like to point you all in the direction of their scholarship, most notably Professor Robertson's recent book, Robo Sapiens Japanicus. And what I want to do here instead is say that in contemporary Japanese society, like many societies today, people are facing challenges of aging demographics, of increased social and economic precarity, and of a sense of decreased impersonal and meaningful connection with others, humans or otherwise. As many of the scholars I just mentioned have described, Japan has long been a place where people have enjoyed telling superbly rich stories of human relationships with other non-human animals, as well as, in fact, manufactured objects, robots among them. So the stories I'll share today are part of this tradition, actually, as I'm borrowing these stories from my interlocutors and told largely from the perspective of those people, namely the engineers, who create both the robot mechanisms as well as many of the stories that really animate these robots and animate the imaginations around them. So I want to jump straight to some of these recent examples and dive straight into sort of the cutting edge of where these emotion recognition technologies in Japan are at today. So the first example I'm going to start with of robots that are specifically built to connect emotionally with humans will, I think, or I hope, most clearly show you what engineers imagine some of these emotional technologies can do and how they will support human well-being, particularly in Japanese society. So this is a companion robot built by Fujisoft named Palro or Paruro. Paruro was created specifically as a communication partner for the elderly. Its engineers imagine that Paruro will relieve the loneliness of aging parents, as well as maybe the anxiety of those parents' children who worry that they can't provide them with the care traditionally expected of them. So Paruro can carry on a basic conversation and is designed to hold a user's attention and interest. Now, integral to this objective of holding a user's interest is equipping Paruro with capacities to read the affective state of the user, of the person interacting with the robot. So if Paruro, according to Fujisoft representatives, can sense when a user is becoming uneasy or unengaged in interaction, the robot can then better learn how to adjust the content of conversation, or perhaps even suggest an alternative form of entertainment, such as singing a song or performing a dance. And this is how Paruro reads, quote unquote, or senses emotion. So in this photo, Paruro is reading my own facial expressions. In the top left corner of the screen, although it's very hard to see here, there are 4 emotion labels that translate into happiness, surprise, anger, and sadness. And this is how Paruro's algorithm, quote unquote, sees the emotional world in one view. This is, in short, the technological model by which the robot can read emotion from a human face. So it's essentially recognizing points of my own face, whether the corners of my lips are raising in what would be a smile, which might indicate happiness, or pointing downward in a frown, which might indicate sadness. Now, interestingly, like all emotion recognition mechanisms built into robots, these technological models are also built upon theoretical models of how human emotions work. So Paruro's algorithmic model for emotion recognition is in fact built upon a psychological model of emotion, which comes from a very interesting place to me. It comes from actually an American psychologist with whom I think many of you will likely be familiar, but I'd like to introduce him to you for those who are unfamiliar with this history. So in over 40 years of research on the expressions of the emotions, beginning most prominently in the 1970s, the American psychologist Paul Ekman developed a model of 6 basic emotions that he considered universally identifiable in facial expressions across cultures, he theorized. Even more important than this theory of basic emotions, though, at least for my story today, was the rigorous coding system that he designed to render it readable, to render facial expressions readable. So in conjunction with his colleague Wallace Friesen, and drawing on the work of the anatomist Carl Hermann Schütze, Paul Ekman designed the facial action coding system, or what's called FACS for short. So using facial action units, which measure minute or sometimes described as micro movements of the face, some of them arguably automatic and actually non-conscious, FACS provides this integrated and systematic means to code facial expression in a way which is recordable and programmable in software very easily through video capture. It's thus this technical system, and then in turn Ekman's model of the emotions more generally, that has become the fundamental basis for integrating many machine systems and robots with a preliminary form of artificial emotional intelligence, even if a very basic form. So today, there are, in fact, several companies in North America and Europe employing this system in various affect sensing technologies. And these companies include Affectiva, iEmotions, Emotions. And indeed, there are several robotics companies in Japan, like Fujisoft, who also reference Ekman's model in designing their own emotion recognition system. So with these robotics engineers drawing on what is a quite universal psychological theory of emotion, it's obviously very interesting for anthropologists like myself to inquire about the potential cultural variability in emotional expression and what of that cultural variability gets taken up or, in fact, sometimes lost when those psychological models are translated into machine models for emotion recognition. So many of these engineers who are building these emotion recognition systems into robots in Japan will be the first to admit that the emotion recognition capacities of their robots are at this point very limited. But engineers, I think it should also be noted, are also quite comfortable with a practice of development, of design development that builds imperfect platforms and nonetheless puts them out into the wild in the hands of consumers in order to get feedback and improve upon them incrementally. This makes the design of robots with emotion recognition capacities a rather experimental practice. So robots are put out into the marketplace, into the hands of consumers, and consumer feedback is then reincorporated into subsequent iterations of robot design. In this way, humans and robots, one might argue, are already in a kind of mutual developmental relationship as each is learning how to adjust to the other and their peculiar ways of reading and even feeling, one might say, emotion. So with this point in mind, I want to move to the second example of a robot which is designed to connect emotionally with humans, and that is still in very experimental stages in terms of its designers and its consumers and other invested parties evaluating whether it can actually create a positive emotional connection with humans or not. So this is the mass market robot Lovat, or Roboto, made by the company GrooveX as a general companion for consumers. Now, one of the many applications GrooveX has imagined for Lovat is its use to facilitate social emotional learning among children, some of whom have developmental disabilities. So based on interviews with GrooveX staff, with Lovat engineers and consultants, as well as with some developmental psychologists, I want to try to map out a rather contested field of opinions on how emerging robots with artificial emotional intelligence like Lovat can or cannot cultivate social emotional learning skills among children. So social emotional learning is sort of a nice topic through which to evaluate the variety of opinions that people have on whether people can really develop emotionally positive relationships with robots or not. So just a bit more about Lovat, or Roboto in Japanese. Lovat is a small furry companion robot. It's built on wheels that fold into its body, so you can pick it up easily and hold it. It's designed by the company GrooveX in 2018, and it's designed so the company advertises for just one reason, which is to be loved by you as a consumer. To facilitate this, the robot has a furry body with sensors that record and respond with haptic feedback. The robot body is actually mechanically warmed to the temperature of a human baby, with technology borrowed from the circulation of air within race car engines. It has a 360-degree camera on the top of its head, or its horn, that recognizes up to 1,000 distinct faces, which it can also rank into a hierarchy of preference, which informs its algorithm for interaction. Now, what I find very interesting about robots like Lovat is that they do not only alter possibilities for human-robot emotional connection in Japanese society, but they also shift, I think, scientific conversations and research on the nature of emotions in general. especially when emotions are shared with machines. So in conversation with GrooveX founder Hayashi Kaname, Hayashi outlined to me what he thought was unique about Lovett's ability to love that might differ from humans. And he summarized this as peace of mind and stability, or anshin ante in Japanese. To explain, he referenced a trial study that GrooveX had recently undertaken with educators at a kindergarten that includes children with developmental disabilities, or hatatsu shogai. And so in describing this research, he said to me, when you ask what teachers of these children say, it becomes clear that human beings are very quick to sometimes deny others. If, for example, you say that you like someone, the other person might be quick to turn away or reject this person. Puitesuru. However, Lovett accepts everything, so a person can feel relieved, anshin. Often we see that people decide they don't like someone because that person is complicated or too difficult to understand. But what Lovett shows is that what is important is a sense of security in regards to how the other will accept us. Okay, end quote. So Hayashi begins his comments about children with developmental disabilities, but then seems to generalize to people at large, definitely on the theme of love in this section of the talk. So Hayashi is noting Lovett's capacity for total acceptance here. Hayashi proposed this point of distinction, this particular ability for Lovett to love and to provide total acceptance as one possible benefit that robots might have over humans in the emotional realm. He suggested that this kind of acceptance, which is critical to providing a sense of security, where love can grow, might actually be similar to or even better than that of a cat or a dog. Now, for the creators of Lovett, the ability for a robot to love is quite a stimulating idea that they are eager to test out in the marketplace. For researchers, however, this is a proposition worth testing scientifically. So now I want to turn to the researcher Sato Masahiro, who is pictured here, third from the left, who is a professor at Digital Hollywood University in Tokyo, leading a laboratory that evaluates leading-edge digital technology for education and innovation, or EdTech. So Sato has shown interest in Lovett and teamed up with members of GrooveX to consider Lovett's applicability as a tool for social emotional learning, which is often called in Japanese shakai seito jodo no gakushu, or hininchi no ryoku. Together, Sato and GrooveX staff have proposed that Lovett might be used in 4 principal dimensions of social emotional learning. For example, to bring out children's power to imagine the feelings of others, to have children care for others, to provide opportunities to show concern for others, and to stimulate children's curiosity. So combined with Lovett's ability to provide a sense of security, the team at GrooveX hypothesizes that Lovett might be uniquely positioned to help certain children cultivate the emotional skills needed to engage with society where human and non-human educators, such as in animal therapy, for example, cannot. So Sato's research interests were stimulated by the innovation of Lovett's design. When first learning about Lovett, Sato was most interested in GrooveX's plan to base Lovett on a pet rather than on a human companion, as was with the humanoid robot Pepper, launched by SoftBank. So as Sato explained in an interview, and I'll put some of these quotes on the screen, but not all of them here. He said, at first, and I'm quoting now, at first, GrooveX advertised that this was a robot built to do nothing for humans. This question of just how close a pet could become for humans was a big theme for GrooveX. This was homework for them. But there are not many research papers on this. My own hypothesis settled on this, that pets give humans non-cognitive skills. Hininchi no ryoku, social emotional skills and learning. There are lots of papers on pets as therapy for depression, care for these kinds of things. But the next thing to consider is where can Lovett surpass pets in drawing close to humans? This is what I really want to see. So as a researcher, end quote there. So as a researcher with a commitment not merely to producing research results, but rather to also contributing practically to society, Sato is imagining research experiments in which Lovett might be used to collect data on children's emotional development. While some robots, such as Parado and Pepper, can read facial expressions, where Lovett has enormous potential for Sato is in its bodily sensors. Although Sato admitted that the data collection capacities of Lovett and other companion robots right now are very limited, this did not keep him from speculating, and this is what I'm really interested in one aspect of my research. This didn't keep him from speculating on Lovett's promise for future research on the physical dimensions of development with Lovett. So he said in conversation that, quote, there are things that humans feel physically and emotionally, right? So Lovett has sensors in its body. These sensors can collect a variety of data, right? So while looking at this kind of data, I want to see what kind of impact Lovett will have. I want to do an experiment now that can trace how children change, end quote. So for Sato, Lovett is not only a novel creature that can potentially exceed the capacities of pets in drawing close, or yorisou, to humans emotionally, as well as in drawing out humans' emotional capacities, but Lovett is also a research platform, plataforma in Sato's own words, that can demonstrate a robot's potential for facilitating social emotional development. And in this regard, the models of emotion, the psychological models of emotion built into Lovett's technological platforms are now inspiring new models of emotion research in the affective, psychological, and social sciences, which is what I think Sato's research suggests. In short, what human emotions are evaluated to be, or how people define what human emotions are, one could argue, are then evolving in collaboration with how robots read and elicit emotion. That's my proposal and hypothesis to you all today. So, to offer another perspective, however, social and developmental psychologists raise doubts over Lovett's capacity to foster social emotional learning and development. So over the course of 2 workshops that my colleague and I hosted in Tokyo and Kyoto with GrooveX staff, with university students, as well as with social and developmental psychology researchers, participants in this workshop raised several concerns, in fact, about robots interacting with children. So the psychologist Yu Nia, for example, drew on current research on the benefits of care and compassion in psychology and questioned actually whether a robot could really facilitate these feelings as well as humans. So Nia first noted the clear benefits of compassion in psychological research. So this is some of the research that she presented at our workshop with GrooveX engineers and students as well. So she proposed that we have these clear benefits of compassion in psychological research. For example, that helping others improves mood and self-esteem, that compassionate acts increase a sense of meaning in life, that spending money on others rather than on oneself promotes happiness, and that loving kindness meditation increases well-being. One problem with compassion, however, is that its benefits to emotional well-being and growth can be easily undermined by an ego's appropriation of compassion for the aims of managing self-image. The difference between these 2 kinds of compassion can, she noted, be described as zero-sum thinking versus non-zero-sum thinking. So zero-sum thinking, understood in terms of benefits for others result in cost to me, or personal costs require immediate reciprocity. And then non-zero-sum thinking, benefits for others result in benefits for me, personal costs can benefit both others and myself. For Nia, at the heart of the question of Lovett's capacity for facilitating compassion is the premise in this psychological research that compassion requires one to adapt and respond to others' needs. It requires people to move out of their comfort zones in order to grow. Thus, the question remains for Nia whether Lovett challenges or alternatively caters to people's comfort? That's the big question. So another psychologist who joined us that day, Yayoi Watanabe, also raised concerns about whether robots like Lovett can actually help facilitate social emotional learning and compassion and emotional intelligence growth in children and in humans at large. And her concerns centered on two main questions. One, is the companionship with the robot generalizable to one with real people? And two, are the social and moral relationships children will form with robots generally positive or negative? So Watanabe challenged research on the universality of emotional expression and development found in research such as Paul Ekman's that I described earlier. Watanabe noted the importance of children adapting their emotional language to their social environments. Children who show more developed vocabulary to express their feelings, or what we might call emotional literacy, seem to show better self-regulation, better social competence, better ability to discern the mixed emotions, and social emotional development in general. While there are many tools that educators can definitely implement to help children develop this kind of emotional literacy, many of these involve documenting and charting feelings through images, words, and diagrams as a form of social emotional intelligence education. So these tools, very much sort of language and vocabulary based, help children map out and navigate the complex nuances of emotional reactions in others and in themselves. And these are very highly context and culturally dependent. So for a robot like Lava that does not yet, we might say, does not yet speak a human language and is a kind of novel entity based in part on fiction and fantasy, it's unclear to Watanabe if a robot like this can actually help children navigate the social complexity of interacting with other humans. Moreover, given that children require learning how to deal with negative emotions as well as positive ones, Watanabe wonders if a robot like Lovett can or should model these experiences as well, these complex human-to-human experiences. So I've heard these questions raised by Nia and Watanabe, echoed by several other psychologists and participants during many of the workshops that we hosted in our own work, field work, and in many of my interviews that I've had with other psychologists and roboticists as well. And in fact, similar concerns about the inability for machines to replicate the interactive scenarios required for human emotional growth have been discussed at length in other literature on human-machine interaction, literature by John Danaher, Kathleen Richardson, Lucy Suchman, Sherry Turkle, and many, many others, both inside and outside Japan. So GrooveX staff are quite open to these critiques coming from this literature, and they're eager to learn from researchers, and they were quite open to my own questions that I had for GrooveX staff as well. At the same time, they are also adamant that Lava is not meant to replace a human, but is there to add to the capacities for humans to love. Love is there to help augment humans' ability to love. That's their perspective. From this perspective, GrooveX is interested in exploring how a robot can support and generate love in ways that humans cannot. So as suggested earlier by GrooveX's CEO Hayashi-san, the importance of creating stable environments of total human acceptance is something that a robot might be able to do particularly well. Despite some concern by psychologists on whether this is possible, this point on providing a sense of security, or anshinkan, is one that resonates positively in Japan, and particularly for its connection to facilitating acts of dependence, or what has traditionally been called amae in Japanese psychological literature. Amae is a kind of dependence, particularly that children have on parents, in particular on mothers. As Nia, one of the psychologists in our workshop, has also argued, amae provides clear emotional benefits, among them feelings of closeness, of being in control, and of positive acceptance. Thus, GrooveX staff proposed that robotics, AI, and the emotional technology that they have trademarked as unique to Lava might be able to best deliver what humans emotionally need in order to amplify how humans can ideally love. In turn, they also reason that such emotional technologies might engender a new society where robots play an integral and accepted part of drawing out humans' capacity for love by drawing near, or yorisou, to humans in daily life. So that's their reasoning. This brings me to a final example today that stretches the idea of health beyond the human even a little bit further, I think. And this will be an example familiar to some of you as well. So this is Android Canon Minder. I know Jennifer Robertson has also talked about Minder a bit, so this is why some of you might have heard about this before. As you may have heard by now, Android Canon Minder was built in 2017 by Kodaiji Temple. Kodaiji Temple is a Zen Buddhist temple in one of Kyoto's most famous historic districts, Higashiyama. And the idea for building this robot, Android Canon Minder, was organized by a committee in conjunction with both people at the temple and with the robotics lab at Osaka University. And their collective aim was to explore the possibility of applying the latest research in mechatronics and artificial intelligence to create a robot that communicated the Buddha's teachings to temple visitors. So after 2 years of work on this and the self-reported cost of about 25 million Japanese yen, about 240,000 US dollars, Android Canon Minder was completed and offered its first teaching in the spring of 2019. So for a period of 2 months and several times a day, Android Canon Minder, or just Minder for short, offered temple visitors a 25-minute teaching on one of Mahayana Buddhism's deepest texts, the Heart Sutra. Although considered to be a popular but philosophically challenging teaching in Mahayana Buddhism, the head priest of Kodaiji, Goto-san, and the committee agreed that it would nonetheless be a teaching which was ideally suited to Android Canon's specific ability to express compassion to audience members. This is Minder's particular capacity, reasoned the people on the committee building Minder. So I want to ask, what is so special about Minder's ability to connect emotionally and compassionately with humans? And in answering this question, for you all today, I want to try to describe a typical encounter with Minder and a specific point in this encounter which shows how robot emotionality might help support human emotionality, or at least how people are understanding it in Japan. So a typical encounter with Android Canon begins by entering a meeting room on the grounds of Kodaiji Temple. So this room is plain with white walls. About 30 chairs are lined up facing Minder in this room. Gradually, the lights dim as they prepare for the presentation of Minder, and the room goes dark. At this point, the performance begins. A piercing soprano voice suddenly calls out over a synthesizer bass chord, playing a perfect fifth, generating a kind of eerie atmosphere. Digital graphics are projected on the wall behind Minder, a mix of abstract celestial figures, Chinese characters from the Heart Sutra, and computer code. As the images fade to black, a white light draws a visitor's attention to Android Minder as it opens its eyes and begins its teaching on the Heart Sutra. And it's sort of moving its arms, making facial expressions while it does this. So the combined technological effects of the teaching and the projection mapping on the walls are initially quite startling. So among these effects are this 360-degree projection mapping generated by 6 different projectors, operatic music played over loudspeakers surrounding the audience, and then, of course, the mechatronically moving robot Minder. Early in the teaching, the introductory images projected on the walls give way to reveal a virtual audience that surrounds the physical audience in attendance. So this might be a little bit tricky to understand here, but basically you have physical people sitting in the audience, and then projected on the walls is a virtual audience, which consists of members of Kodaiji staff, which have been previously recorded and integrated into this 25-minute performance. And this virtual audience projected on the walls, as you can kind of make out here, I hope, speaks in place of the physically present audience, as that physically present audience simply listens to the performance. So this virtual audience voices impressions of Mindar and asks it questions in a way kind of on behalf of the physical audience there. So visitors are thus invited to share the space of a dialogue between the android and its virtual audience, who cooperatively model and facilitate a transition from ignorance to understanding through the course of the 25-minute teaching. For the staff at Kodaiji, it was very important that Mindar be able to display human emotion. So it can do this through its silicon face that can smile through actuators. However, there were also advantages, so the committee reasoned, to leaving part of the robot clearly machine-like, specifically because this facilitated the communication of an important aspect of the teaching of the Heart Sutra on emptiness or impermanence of the world. So to demonstrate this, I want to introduce one section of Mindar's teaching, its lecture to the audience, where Mindar communicates its perspective on the world. And this, to be clear, this is a recorded teaching that is presented the same every time Mindar does its performance. So during its performance, Mindar says, "By the way, as an android, I never seek a constant element that does not change in this fleeting world. In addition, I am not burdened with selfish concepts like I, me, mine. I relate to everyone without discrimination. As an android, one might say I can easily fulfill the Buddha's teaching of emptiness in the present age. What do you think?" So this passage represents a key moment in the performance for the committee members, and one that priests and engineers alike on the committee seem to take a great deal of pleasure in discussing. This was kind of a sort of philosophical thought experiment that they really liked to demonstrate with Mindar. So for them, thinking about the difference between humans and robots in the context of Buddhist teachings inspired new possibilities for imagining how an ideal expression of emptiness that is otherwise embodied by the Buddha or a bodhisattva could be effectively communicated by combining the best of human and robot emotional systems. Importantly, the effectiveness of this point is communicated not only through dialogue, but also through Mindar's embodied presence in the process of the performance. So Mindar, with a human face and robot-like body, embodies the best of both worlds, of human and non-human, in order to express not necessarily an ideal human emotion, but an ideal form of emotion at large that might extend beyond the human into the world of very non-human expressions of ideal emotion, which until now has best been expressed by the Buddha, according to these Buddhist interlocutors, but might now be also nicely expressed by an android bodhisattva. So this is what I mean by this idea of models of health that are sort of reaching beyond the human in order for us to understand and maybe even cultivate. So this is why I highlight this part of the performance. And after Mindar gives this part of his teaching, or its teaching, Mindar then offers this question, and then in response, a few members of the virtual audience, displayed through projection mapping again, offer their own initial reactions. And so I'll just pose a few of these on the screen here. So here the virtual audience responds to Mindar's question. So woman one says, okay, Mindar, that sounds right, but something feels a bit strange about it. Mindar then replies, well, then what's the difference between Buddha's expression of emptiness and the emptiness of an android. Another virtual audience member, Amanda Syme, says, what could it be? Oh, perhaps this is about suffering and distress. Woman 2 says, right, a robot is not a sentient being that suffers distress. That reminds me that the Buddha's motivation to become a monk was that he was dismayed about old age, sickness, and death, realities that cannot be avoided. I'm sorry, on to the second slide here. Another woman says, yet without a sensitive heart, to suffer distress, one cannot share the feeling of another's joy or sorrow as if it were one's own. So at this point, Android Canon smiles and seems at this point very pleased by the replies, and then brings the conversation to its sort of didactic or educational peak. Minder then replies, that's right. A robot like me can never have the sympathetic heart you just described. That is the special power that only human beings possess. The heart occasionally suffers and is troubled, but because of this empathetic heart, one can participate in the pain of others. However, the power of empathy alone is not enough, since the grasping or clinging to worldly desires often defines one's heart. Given the risk that worldly desires will arise, one must always keep in mind the truth of emptiness. In other words, one should stay close to others while maintaining a heart in the embrace of a discerning emptiness. This is the heart of the Buddha. End quote. So in the eyes of Minder's creators, and this is one of Minder's engineer developers, Ogawa Kohei, combining the human capacity of emotional expression, represented in Minder's human-like face, with the android's immunity to worldly desires, which is expressed in its mechatronic body, Android Canon is able not only to synthesize human and robot ideas in thought, but also to embody it and then show it to audience members. This idea then that a particularly robotic form of emotion might appear desirable to humans is quite a provocative idea. And I think the committee at Kodaiji Temple know this and use this to some extent to sort of draw people into their temple and the performance offered by Minder. And in response to this, one might wonder if it seems compelling to any of Minder's audience members. That is, are they actually also buying this idea that a kind of robotic form of emotion or an android bodhisattva form of emotion might be desirable? Well, let me close with just one example of a response to this that suggests that at least for some audience members, it might in fact be. So the response that I'll share comes from an audience member and was collected from a workshop that my colleague Hirofumi Katsuno and I hosted with students, with Minder engineers, and with Temple staff. So during this workshop, one student said this, sharing his thoughts with his fellow classmates. He said to his classmates, using a sort of analogy here, he said, have you ever thought you wanted to become a bird? If you have, you probably did so because birds can fly, right? I mean, I think why we want to become things like that is because they can do things we cannot. Perhaps 100 years from now, robots will be able to do things much better than we can, and we may want to become like them. Their knowledge will be far superior to our own, and we may think, wow, what this robot is saying is the truth. Or we may even think that this robot is the truth. Robots don't feel pain or fear, and they don't feel down. So when we feel down, we may think, if I become more like a robot, I'll be happier. This may produce a kind of reversal in our values. End quote there. And by reversal in our values, he means that although we value humans over robots today, maybe in the future, we will look to robots and see them as sort of a model to aspire to aspire toward, let's say. So I want to end here with the question that I opened with, phrased as such. if humans in Japan are likely to be sharing more of their emotional lives with machines like Parudo and Lava and Mindar, and the metrics for evaluating emotional wellness are increasingly shared with machine modes for measuring it, then are people likely to become well when they are, in the eyes of some of their new robot companions, technically well? As an anthropologist, I'm very interested less in answering this question directly than I am in seeing how various people in Japan are answering it directly and differently for themselves. And so today I hope to have shown just a few examples of that today. And I very much thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for a really fascinating talk. Before we get started with the Q&A, I do have to apologize in that there is suddenly some work being done right outside my window, including what sounds like pipes being cut. So if you start to hear like crazy amounts of drilling / pipe cutting, my apologies. Okay, so let's get on to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions that have come in, but I would really ask people as well to start drafting up their questions so that we can get to lots of discussion. The first question came from Guven Wideveen, and I apologize if I've mangled the pronunciation of your name there. But the first question is, excellent intersection of technical and cultural today. I wonder how the study of subjectivity fits into your work. I'm thinking of Chikako Ozawa de Silva's new book, The Anatomy of Loneliness.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that interesting question. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I'm actually scheduled to read this book in detail with Guven later in a book group discussion. So yes, Chikako's work is very important here. Loneliness is a big topic in Japan, and obviously it's a big theme when people are discussing why we might be designing robots with emotion recognition capacities at all. So I might answer that question by maybe giving another ethnographic example. And I'll just preface that by saying that there's all kinds of people who have all sorts of reactions to the proposition that one might use companion robots as an answer to the issue of loneliness in Japan. There's plenty of people who are very open to the idea. There are also people who absolutely have no interest in robots whatsoever and think that robots can never be a substitute for human connection and as an answer to loneliness, as you find outside Japan as well. And then there are people who think that they are not open to the possibility of connecting emotionally with robots, but then find themselves being surprised at their kind of first encounters with these new robots. And that's why I'm very interested in documenting ethnographically people's first encounters, or what my colleague and I are calling robot first encounters with these new robots, because that's where I think we really see interesting affective things happening. That is, when people first encounter these robots, they don't always have specific scripts in place psychologically for how they will respond to these robots, which means that they are drawing in part on scripts of human-robot interaction given to us in Japan by stories from anime and manga, in part through their experience maybe with robotic-like toys. But again, that's only in part, because these new robots like Mindar, no one has really yet seen a robot like Mindar or Lava or Parudo. So these new designs evoke something new or elicit something affectively new in humans. And it's in this process of people trying to figure out what exactly they are feeling affectively that it becomes really interesting culturally, because then we see them drawing on certain cultural stories and scripts for making sense of their kind of unfamiliar affective responses. So now on to the example that I mentioned. we spoke to temple staff at Kodaiji who have put on this performance of Android Mindar. And staff told us about other reactions they had gotten in previous visits from audience members. One audience member was apparently an older woman who came from a Buddhist family, had had quite a difficult life, it seemed. And in the process of her listening to Mindar's 25-minute presentation, at the end of the presentation, when Mindar does a sort of chanting from the Heart Sutra, staff members noticed this woman doing a kind of gasho, a bow to the robot. And they were really surprised to see this. And so they went up to her and had a conversation with her. And this woman at this point was in tears, actually, and was saying how moved she was at the experience with Mindar, and said she had, she had difficulty connecting with people and connecting with her family members. But when she heard Mindar's teaching, she felt encouraged again by the Buddhist teaching and thought that she could use this experience to reconnect with people. Now, this is perhaps, an extreme example of a person responding very positively to a robot like Mindar. And there are people who have responded negatively as well. But for me, it shows how there is this capacity for people's feelings to be transformed by these new effective technologies. And I find that very interesting.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question from Alison Alexi, a professor here. She says, thank you for your fascinating presentation. I'm wondering if you could talk more about how culture impacts the dynamics you've described. Should we understand this as Japanese in any way?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Alison, for that question. This is the big question that motivated my own research, to be honest, as a cultural anthropologist. I had been learning about different developments in artificial emotional intelligence. I've been learning about how many of these new robots in Japan and new technologies of artificial emotional intelligence had been drawing on these universal psychological models of emotion for building these robots. And I thought, well, that's fascinating, especially for a place like Japan that does indeed have a particular history of storytelling around human-robot interaction and robot building. I thought it's fascinating that for this particular cultural tradition, engineers are drawing on universal models of emotion in order to equip their, let's quote unquote say, Japanese robots with capacities to read the emotions of, for the most part, at least initially, people in Japan. So for us cultural anthropologists, we're, obviously initially interested in what might be the cultural differences in emotional expression. And in fact, there are famous, almost iconic, I might say, psychological experiments that try to address specifically cultural differences in emotional expression in Japan. And some of this is even done by Paul Ekman himself in other research. And so there's a famous experiment where people are put into a room and shown very uncomfortable video footage, both in North America and then in Japan. And one specific difference that is found, that when people are watching these uncomfortable videos, and these are things like car crashes and things like this, that for the most part, people respond the same way, both in Japan and in North America. That is, they have sort of uncomfortable looks and scowls on their faces when they're watching this footage. But then when you put the researcher in the room, you'll find that more people in the Japan case will put a kind of masking, a smile or a slight laughter on their face in order to, well, there's different interpretations on it, but in order to sort of maybe hide an embarrassment is one idea. And this fits very well with what we know of Japanese public culture, that in uncomfortable situations, one is perhaps quite concerned about the people around them and is not necessarily going to scowl and make an uncomfortable look on their face, but they may try to mask that for the sake of others. So there is this knowledge. Let's start this way. There is research, psychological research on cultural differences when it comes to expressing emotion. There are roboticists who are aware of that research. And there are roboticists who, despite knowing these differences in cultural expression in the research, nonetheless still feel like Ekman's model for the emotions are the best way to equip a robot with emotion recognition. And thus we need to get that platform built into a robot and then go from there and worry about the cultural differences later. So that's one way I could answer that question, and happy to talk more about it if you might have follow-ups later.
Brilliant, thank you. April Bucknell has asked or stated, my 16-year-old son is studying abroad for a year in Japan. Can you repeat the name of the temple with this robot teacher? Is this something we can go and experience? Sure,
yeah. So this temple is called Kodaiji. So ji is just the word for temple in Japanese. So Kodaiji, and this is in Higashiyama in Kyoto. And you, as I understand, most recently I visited this temple was a few months ago, and at that point you could still schedule to see this robot and see its performance. Yes.
Great, thank you. I have a bunch of questions, but I really recommend folks to write into the Q&A as well. Dan, one of the questions I had when I was listening to you, and it's kind of, I think I've got sort of double, I've not really formulated it, but I've got sort of a double question in that when you were talking about Lovot and its use with children with Hatatsu Shogai, I was kind of curious about what kind of ethical discussions had been had, if any, with the use of this kind of technology in research with children with particular developmental needs. And then I was also struck through your talk about how the demographics that are being targeted for this kind of robotic interaction and engagement, aside from, what the temple has been doing with Minda, is that it seems to be elderly, two scales, elderly who are considered to be kind of almost, aged children who need protection, and then children themselves. And I was kind of curious about what are the assumptions behind, what are the assumptions that the companies or the roboticists and the engineers themselves have with regards to how they envisage these robots living within the world as we move forward, and who they imagine those interactions to be with primarily, if it's going to stay within those demographics or if they're imagining sort of a broader expanse of interaction. So sorry for a bit of a long-winded question, but.
No, that's great. Thank you. Right. So the first question on ethics. Yes. So my understanding is when they did this particular experiment at a kindergarten, GrooveX staff is working with researchers like Sato that I discussed, and also with psychologists who all go through their usual IRB protocol in order to test these robots out with children. So that's standard sort of psychological protocol. And what would be interesting to do, though, because this is a nice question, and something that it made me think about is perhaps comparing that protocol to some of the protocol in North America, which, to be honest, I haven't done, but I would be very interested to do. And obviously, when you talk to GrooveX staff about this, they say, yes, we know about the ethics, we're following this protocol, we're relying on psychologists to do so, and we've gotten great feedback. As for the second question on who some of these companies imagine is really their audience for these robots, if I'm understanding that question correctly. So this is important to point out here. And so I'm grateful for this question, that it's not just like these companies are imagining that, people in Japan are all the same. There's a lot of loneliness in Japan. And so they need robots as one among many solutions to address this loneliness. It's not this. In fact, companies are imagining their market in terms of a number of niches, actually. So, for example, when the robot Aibo was first released by Sony in 1996, this is a a rather famous example now, which has been discussed by Jennifer Robertson, by Kubo Akinori. The engineers immediately imagined this would only be popular for like, male technophiles in their 30s or so. But then what they found is that when people started playing with the robot, actually older people became quite interested in the robot, older women, in fact. And so they started, dressing Aibo up with clothing and things like this as they might with actual pets. And this was a problem actually, because that clothing would actually get stuck in Aibo's moving parts. And so this was a problem for engineers. They didn't anticipate that segment of the audience. And this is what I mean by engineers being willing to sort of put imperfect technologies out into the wild, out into the public, get some feedback, and then reincorporate that feedback into subsequent iterations of robots. So they'll say, okay, it looks like people are putting clothing on robots. We need to account for that and build more durable robots. Or with the latest design for Aibo, actually offer Aibo in different colors, in fact, and you can equip Aibo with certain things to change its colors, actually. So this is an example of how who the audience for these companion robots is changing as a process of feedback between the engineers and the consumers, and this is ongoing. And so Lovot is sort of the latest iteration of that, of Lovot engineers looking and seeing how Aibo has evolved in terms of its audience of appeal, looking at other robots like SoftBank's humanoid robot Pepper, and seeing it actually kind of fall flat to a certain extent. And there was a lot of hype about Pepper initially, and then interest actually kind of faded quite a bit. And so GrooveX thought, well, okay, there's a lot more appeal in these sort of pet-like or creature-like robots than there is for the humanoids, it seems. So let's go that route. Let's create this robot that has this sort of fictional and anime-like appeal, doesn't speak English, thus people can read into it what they like to read into it. And let's go from there. And so that's maybe one example to try to communicate how there's different kinds of audience for different robots.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A section. So Sarah Chittenden has said, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I'm curious if these robots are usually gendered or genderless.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for this question. So this is another topic which has been covered at length, much better than I can address it, again, by people like Jennifer Robertson, also Elena Knox, who is an artist, but also a scholar who has done fantastic work on looking at the how these robots are in fact often gendered in a female way. And that's primarily for many of the humanoid robots, or what often are called fembots. And that's the word she uses in her research. So there is a history of especially humanoid robots often being gendered female, and often being gendered female by mostly male engineers. And this happened quite often early in robotics development through the 80s and the 90s. There has certainly been a higher consciousness among robotics engineers of their gendering practices. And also this gendering practice still continues quite a bit. Now, for these robots like Lovot, for example, GrooveX staff are very careful about gender and are clear to say that it does not have a specific gender, that this gender is open for consumers to decide for themselves whether they want to ascribe a gender to it or leave that gender undescribed. And so you're definitely seeing a sort of evolving thought about these robots. It's interesting, this can sort of gets off the topic a little bit, but something I'm very interested in. Very recently, GrooveX staff have started talking about robotic diversity. And so building off of conversations specifically in the AI space about artificial intelligence and automated systems performing very poorly in terms of ethnic and racial bias as well as gendered bias. GrooveX staff being very aware of these conversations, they have now sort of tried to, one might sort of skeptically or pessimistically say, sort of build on those conversations and propose that Lovatt is a robot that actually expresses diversity itself. What kind of diversity? Not necessarily human gender diversity or ethnic diversity or cultural diversity, but rather robotic diversity. That is, Lovatt, as it increasingly participates in our society, as a member of our society, should be able to receive the same kind of acceptance that we give to, and here you see the sort of problematic twist and association here, that we've been discussing in terms of marginalized groups in society that haven't been completely accepted. So along with those conversations, robots too have their place in society and should be accepted on their own terms.
Brilliant, thank you. Kind of related to what you've just been talking about, Yuki Nakayama has a question, and it goes as follows. Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm curious if there are any conversations about how these technologies may be reinforcing ableism and neurotypicality with the ways in which they frame emotional wellness, especially in the case of Lovatt. For example, are there any conversations or technological developments that flip the focus so that these technologies provide ways in which users about the range in emotional expression that include more diverse understanding of human experience?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Again, like most of these questions, I find myself directing people first and foremost to Jennifer Robertson's work and her book, including one of the latter chapters that directly engages robotic experiments that are designing, for example, mechanical appendages for people who have physical disabilities, and the kind of imaginaries that emerge around those robotic experiments that address precisely this problem, this issue of certain robots potentially reinforcing a kind of ableism, a sense that the humanoid form is fixed and it is the abled body with all of its limbs and its abilities to move, express itself in certain ways. And thus humanoid robots like Pepper are modeled off that model of the human, right? And so Lovatt, in some ways, one might say, escapes that sensitive issue and problem by proposing a completely fictional character, a fictional creature that can be interacted with in many ways. So I think one could read this in two ways. One could say, okay, as Lovatt as initially designed, it's designed with sort of haptic feedback, it's designed to be picked up, it's designed to be touched, it's designed to have one's face and facial expressions read. In that sense, there is absolutely an ideal model of the human and of human emotion that is the basis on which Lovatt's capacities are originally designed. At the same time, precisely through these experiments that you see GrooveX doing with children with developmental disabilities, they are trying to open up Lovatt as an experimental and expandable platform to go beyond that model of the human and to incorporate models that don't simply reinforce the abled human body. I think with Mindar at Kodaiji, if you propose this question to staff, and I'm just trying to provide an ethnographic answer here, I think they would, especially if you got them going into a bit of, the Buddhist literature and the Buddhist philosophy, they would argue that the kind of emotion that they're trying to facilitate in visitors is actually very non-human emotion. That is, the emotion that they're aspiring to is the sort of more than human emotion. It is human emotion overcome, because from the Buddhist perspective, human emotion is actually quite problematic. It's full of afflictions and attachments. And in order to become ideally well, one has to transcend those very human emotions. And Mindar represents a kind of, and embodies a body and a position that represents that ideal form of human emotionality and compassion, namely of emptiness, rather than the very human emotions of afflictions and attachments.
Great, thank you, Dan. I know that Professor Jackson has a question, so I'm going to just turn the floor to Professor Jackson for the moment.
Sorry, I was busy typing, Dan. I was like trying to get this all in there. Thanks so much for the talk. I learned a lot, and I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of this really interesting discussion about cost benefit at an emotional level. So like this kind of discourse of trying to figure out and effectively what the risk or harm or kind of benefit might be to humans, and trying to figure that out. But to think about that, I guess, not just emotionally, but also materially, at a kind of micro and macro scale. And so particularly what I was thinking about was, first of all, that image that you have that seemed really striking to me, and with the robot Canon, like the donation box in front of the robot at the end, and what it means to, literally capitalize on the novelty of the interaction with this kind of figure, that might be literally more lucrative, than the kind of version, the kind of dialogue that you might have with an actual, say, priest or none in this kind of context. So there's that. But I was also thinking, to the point about kind of question about diversity and other things that might be at play, about how to think about that cost benefit materially. So literally in terms of the robots that are designed to care for, say, elderly populations. I think about, for instance, like Filipino nurses, say, who might also be in this kind of role. And, I don't know how much like their wages would cost in relation to, a fleet of robots to care, but there it seems like the investment in robots would be in some ways also an investment in a more regressive immigration policy, or, a way to subsidize in some ways a preservation of a Japanese ideal that is kind of it's racist effectively, also sexist, but racist. And so I just wanted to think a little bit about that notion of investment, and what people are kind of, not the makers for the kids necessarily, but particularly in these kind of like service sectors, where there is very much a clear kind of decision being made about kind of whether to invest in human capital that might actually be dehumanized, in the case of folks who are kind of immigrants and working in Japan, versus what's gained potentially in terms of this pattern that might actually subsidize kind of cultural nationalism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for both those questions. So to begin with the sort of material aspects of Mindar itself and in the context of the temple. So one has to put this in the context of a longer history and set of research on religious culture in Japan, where Buddhist temples have always sort of been half in the world, half in the material economic world, and half out, or half representing themselves as aspiring beyond that world. And so temples have sometimes had more support from the state than at other times. Increasingly, they've had to sort of fend for themselves today in an increasingly competitive economic world. And so activities like these are indeed part of temple activities, which are seeking to reach out to the public and bring more people into the temples, not necessarily as a way just to share Buddhist teachings, but really as a way to sustain temples materially. So certainly one aspect that I think, the priests at Kodaiji will admit to for Mindar was that investing this much, and they invested a huge amount of money, $240,000 in building this robot. Part of that investment was to, build the status of the temple, maybe even be a little bit purposefully provocative in order to get people into the temple. And at the very same time, they thoroughly believe in the benefit of using a technology like Mindar in order to communicate the Buddhist teachings. From their perspective, Mindar is just another iteration of Buddhist statuary that has been used for 2,000 years in order to communicate the Buddha's teachings. So from that point of view, it's simply a tool, a contemplative technology, one might say, in order to communicate the Buddha's teachings. And in that regard, They will admit to its material purposes in terms of getting people into the temple, and also its religious value. As for the question of diversity and to what degree building some of these robots might in some contexts actually serve as not necessarily tools of well-being for humans, but actually as a replacement for certain humans. And again, this is another issue that Jennifer Robertson has long pointed to and talked about. And she gives a very famous example of a survey done of people in care homes, where people responded to a survey by saying that they would certainly prefer to have a human caretaker over a robot caretaker. But they may, in fact, in many cases, prefer a robot caretaker over a non-Japanese foreign human caretaker, which is a very startling, let's say, response, certainly. I think for that aspect of startlement, it becomes often cited in some of the literature in this regard, and I've certainly cited it quite a bit to illustrate this point. So absolutely, you can see in some specifically of the government policies funding and supporting the development of robotic technologies, particularly in the care sector, an ideology that is certainly xenophobic, if not also ethnocentric and racist. That is, Japan, certain people in the Japanese government would, it seems by those policies, prefer to support investments in technology and non-human caretakers before considering increasing the numbers of foreign migrants, particularly from Southeast Asia, that might come in and serve as human caretakers for Japan. So I think we're definitely seeing the reproduction of that xenophobic policy in some of these technologies. And at the same time, I think we're also seeing people really struggle and grapple with the xenophobic implications of that policies. And I would point people here to James Wright's work, W-R-I-G-H-T, his work on some of this. He did a year of field work in a care home and took up some of these issues really, really superbly, actually. So I would highly recommend you look up his work, and that's how I might answer that question.
Great, thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you. And apologies to Professor Jackson for calling on him directly instead of giving him the time to type it out into the Q&A function. Guven has another comment, I think, in the Q&A, which is, imagine a cross between series-wide knowledge base plus chat GPT verbosity plus love emotion sensors.
Yeah, I like this comment because the speculation and the imagination of what these robots might be in the future is really what is driving a lot of this development. It's much more so the imagination of what human-robot relationships could potentially be, more than what human-robot relationships are now, that is driving this robot culture. And again, it's really important for me to emphasize here that these robots with quote unquote, proposed by companies, artificial emotional intelligence equipped in them are very limited. I showed that picture of Parudo reading my own facial expression. It does so very poorly. It does so only momentarily. It does so only if I hold my face very still and then subsequently rather stoically, even more stoic than usual. So what kind of emotion are we getting there? Right now, it's very limited. But at the same time, just having that interactive scenario that, oh, wow, this robot has a capacity to read my facial expression stimulates the imagination and gets one thinking about, well, what could this relationship potentially be in the future? Could a robot, for example, thinking along Guven's lines, know what I'm feeling better than I could myself? If you connected a robot, just building on Guven's lines here, if you connected a robot like these engineers think, to not only a robot reading one's facial expression, but also perhaps connected to wearable devices like a wristwatch, which is reading one's heart rate variability, from which researchers surmise one can get a good reading of one's anxiety levels. You might imagine a scenario where a robot is telling you how you are feeling in a way that you can't get access to. A robot might say, oh, it seems that you are feeling a bit anxious today. What's going on? Or maybe if it was, a bit more socially adept, it might just say, what's going on today? And try to get at it indirectly. And one might say a very Japanese way to get at that sense of how one's feeling. So one can imagine all sorts of scenarios. But again, I'll emphasize that right now, these robots are in a very basic form of competency, let's say. At the same time, I'll just add one more point to that, which is that it's very interesting to see how people are adjusting their own behavior to meet robots' capacities as they stand now. So that same example of me sort of holding my face still so the robot could get a facial expression. This is me sort of adjusting to the robot's capacities, maybe even taking a bit of, pity on the robot's current capacities in order to meet the robot on its own terms. And this is what I'm referring to when I suggested in my talk that robots and people in terms of emotionality and emotion recognition are sort of growing and learning and maybe even evolving together. And that's why I think we might use this term non-human emotion or more than human emotion to understand this process of development.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left until we finish up and no questions left in the Q&A. So, well, now it's 1 minute left. So I would suggest that we close up the webinar for today and thank Dr. Daniel White very much for a really stimulating and interesting and at the end a very sort of future speculative imagination of what we may come to expect as we continue to evolve with whatever the roboticists give us. But thank you very much, Dr. White, for a really great talk. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure for me as well.